Hey, what's up, everybody? Evan here I'm calling it the art of mental fitness. Why wait until things get bad to start getting fit? Basically, it's a show about mental illness, but I don't want to alienate people who don't have a mental illness. I think a lot of this stuff can really help people who don't. Because, the blight of today's age is we all suffer from some sort of mental discrepancy, if you will. But essentially what we're going to talk about today is two things. We're going to talk about the pain and death of fantasy and then how to know if you're bipolar or not. So if you're not bipolar, you could skip the second half. But if you are, or you think you might be, you might want to take a listen to that. But before we start, I wanted to bring a word by our sponsors. I'm just kidding. There are no sponsors yet. Anyways, what we want to do today is we're going to be looking at the pain and death of fantasy. This is something near and dear to my heart because I used to be a fanatical fantasizer. Hey! Anyways, what fantasy means is basically creating an expectation in your head of you, of a situation, of anything, really. And what that does, it's a term that we coined back when I was in treatment called loading the gun. So loading the gun means you go into a situation or an interaction or something with the gun loaded with an idea of how this is going to go down. Here's a perfect example. You have an interview for a job and you load the gun. You're like, I'm going to go in there. I'm going to crush it. I'm going to look amazing. I'm going to know all the answers. They're going to take one look at me and go like, do you want to be the CEO? Like, do you want to just be the boss? Here, you know what? We'll pay you. You don't have to work, right? Obviously a very exaggerated fantasy. You go in with the loaded gun, right? That's your expectation, and you fail miserably. So the solution is to never have any expectations for yourself. Just kidding. That is not the way to do it. We will approach how to appropriately visualize, and mentally create situations later at the end of the segment. But what I want to talk about first is, why do you create a fantasy in the first place? I think it's very easy for us to slip into this, I'm going to call it a false reality, but basically it's this concept or construct, the Matrix. It's the Matrix. It's the Matrix of your mind, because that's the ideal. And I talked about yesterday's episode, I talked about, for me, like my fantasy of my profound self who wakes up and drinks green tea after 8 hours of pure sleep and meditates and writes forever. Right? That's a fantasy. And what that fantasy does is it takes me in this moment and provides me relief. Go back and watch the episode about the shameless monster, but it provides me with strokes that comforts me, that brings me validation in this moment. Now, so if I'm sitting here, I'm talking with you guys, and I'm fantasizing about just having millions of listeners in the most popular YouTube podcast in the history of all things, I'm giving myself credit for something that's not happened. Two, it's very unrealistic, but also that I'm making myself feel good about something that's literally shot, in my freaking office. Why? Why is that important? Why do we do it? And then, I just covered why we do it. Why is that important? How does that set us up for what's called the pain and death of fantasy? So basically, what that sets us up for is to get our expectations crushed. And it'll actually put you in a lot of bad situations because you're striving after some expectation that, one, may not be realistic, or two, just might not even be possible. Okay, I think another common one is like guys when they come in to train, especially fighters, like, I want to fight, I want to bang. And then you come in and you realize, dear Lord, this is way harder than I think. I thought I was going to come in here and beat everyone up. Not a chance. Okay? And what, let me just back this up for a second. What I want to say most of all is that this is a natural part of life. Like thinking and dreaming and creating things in your mind, this is a natural process, okay? It's okay to have a slightly loaded gun of a situation, to expect more of yourself, to expect a good presentation, but it's not okay to dwell. And when we start slipping into fantasy is when we make these mental constructs and they get more and more elaborate. Right? You see a lot of guys with girls. I'm going to get this girl. She's going to be beautiful. She's going to be rich. She's going to be all these things, blah, 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 blah. And you make this fantasy in your mind, and then when you go out into the real world, you're never going to find anything like that. Right? So why that's causing so much pain is nothing is ever going to live up to your fantasies. Nothing is ever going to live up to the construct of your mind, because your mind is a lying monster. Your mind works in black and white and perfectionist. Right? And it has this super, super fast dynamic that it can create anything it wants right away. Boom, 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 boom. And it's imagination, right? And it's a great part of our mind, but if it goes unchecked, it causes a lot of pain. So now I want to talk about what the pain of the fantasy is. And the pain of the fantasy is, yes, it's having your expectations let down, but more so of the pain is it gives you validation of something that hasn't happened, or isn't going to happen, right? And what that does is it makes this moment now worse, right? Because you're setting this goal, you're setting this fantasy far in advance, and you need to close that gap to make yourself feel good. You need to close that gap so you can experience the validation that you're looking for, and you're never going to get there because it's not even a real fantasy, or it's going to be really, really down the road and hard to get to. Okay? So what happens? What happens when we start to experience this pain is we get discouraged, right? You go out, you try something for a little. Trust me, I'm guilty of this to all hell. You just quit. You go out, you try something, you quit. You go out, you try something, it's too hard, you quit. You do this for a while, you quit. You meet someone, you quit. You do these things and you run away because on a certain level, the drug, the fantasy is actually better than the real experience. And I used to joke, at least it was me in college. I was like, how come parties are never as fun as they sound in my head before we go? Right? Like the party sounds so fun, then you go to the party, it's not even as fun because, you built it up to be this amazing construct in your mind. This causes pain. And anytime you start to fantasize, you need to start thinking about, okay, I'm causing myself pain. I'm causing myself distress. I'm causing myself to live in a world that's not real. Okay? And I want to kind of pivot this into kind of what I was talking about yesterday a little bit more in the sense that when we fantasize about our self-identity, right? When we fantasize about self-identity, I'm going to be so temperate. I'm going to be so kind. I'm going to be generous. I'm going to crush my depression. I'm going to feel no anxiety, right? You do the exact same thing. You put this expectation on yourself. You create this false future self. You make this huge space before you feel validated, before it's anything that you can do. And then you ultimately end up crushing yourself because you're never going to get there in that sense, okay? But who gives a shit about all this theory? Whatever. Let's talk about the practical and the death of the fantasy, okay? So something that I do, and I'm not going to say I do it perfectly, but something that I do is as soon as I slip into fantasy, as soon as I start imagining myself like just doing something amazing or, creating all this fantastic, I shut that F down. I shut it down, and I shut it down hard. I shut it down. You got to have control over your mind. As Master Samuel says, you have to make your mind the slave. And I know it's like, not so PG. Anyways, you have to tell your mind who's boss. And if you start to slip into designing yourself in the future and all this stuff, shut it down. Shut it down. Shut it down and shut it down hard. Okay? You have complete control over what you fantasize about. This isn't about addiction. This isn't about depression. This isn't about like some other obscure thinking OCD. This is about literally a conscious choice. I know fantasy feels good. I know it's easy to do, but it will ultimately cause you more harm than good. It's kind of like a drug. Maybe we should call this segment the drug of fantasy. So you got to shut those fantasies down. You're like, Evan, that's so just easy. Yeah, you got to do it. You got to shut it down. You got to recognize, you have to acknowledge, and then you have to shut it down, okay? But don't do this. Don't just no thinking about my fantasy, and then you instantly will start fantasizing. What you do. And one, if you're more skilled in sort of mental dynamics, you can pivot into creating a more realistic expectation and walk yourself back. You go from being a celebrity to being a successful leader in your community to making some good content to just getting out there and publishing something and then just feeling good the fact that you're making anything. Wait, Evan, did you just talk about yourself? Anyways, so that's walking it back. But let's say you're not very good at mental dynamics. You don't really have that kind of mental control yet. You can get it. Read my book, Mental Dynamics. I'm just kidding. I don't have a book called Mental Dynamics. I wish I did, though. That'd be tight. Anyways, so what you do if you're not too good at that is you shut it down by distracting yourself. And this is a huge, huge, huge behavioral technique. It doesn't work for everything, but I feel like for fantasy, it works amazing. And that is you just immediately start doing something else. So you're sitting in your room and you're fantasizing about this amazing girlfriend that you don't have, and you start to feel the love. You need to shut it down, get up, clean. I don't want to clean. Get on freaking, I would barely get on social media and start trolling your eyes out until the fantasy goes away. Social media might be a big part of why our fantasies are so out of control. But just troll your brains out. Do something, right? So get off of there. Just get your mind off the topic. I'm not going to give you lame ones like exercise, do 100 push-ups. I mean, like go watch TV, call somebody, do something you like, read a book, take a shower, and anything to get you out of your head in that sense. I like playing chess. I love chess. Anyways, so that's kind of what we're looking at. Let's just recap that real quick. We have the pain and death of fantasy. Number one is we create fantasies, right? We create these expectations in our mind. We build these mental constructs to make ourselves feel good in this moment. It could also be to appease anxiety. It could also be to, moderate. It could be a lot of things. But basically, you're doing it to make yourself feel good in this moment. The problem with that and the pain of the fantasy is it loads the gun, right? It puts all this expectation on you, and nothing in life ever is as good as you expect it to be. It'll be better than you expect it to be, but it'll never be as good as you expect it to be, if that makes any sense. And that will cause you pain because you're going to be going to situations, expecting outcomes, and not getting the results because you're a fantasy. Okay? Then what we do is we shut that F down. This is how you cause the death of the fantasies. You shut it down. Shut it down. If you're good at mental dynamics, and what that means is controlling your thought process, what you do is you start to walk it back. You walk back your expectations. You walk back your visualizations. You walk back your mental constructs so it's more realistic until you're actually doing something in the moment. Or if you just want the quick and easy method, you just start distracting yourself. Just do something else. Do anything else that's not fantasizing. Usually something physical. There's just something you like to do. It can just literally be trolling. It doesn't have to be productive at all.